Yikes. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Dawn Bergacker. I'm one of the reference and instruction librarians here, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming. I'm going to thank a few people here while I make sure that everything is working, and then Sean is going to introduce our speaker. I would like to thank the All Pikes Peak Reads committee here at PPCC, especially some of the people that come to the committee meetings all the time. Wayne Artist, Janelle Johnson, who's here, Kimberly Baker. We have a lot of people that help us every year, and I really appreciate you. Right now, we're also streaming to the Rampart Range campus in the downtown studio. And at Rampart Range, we have Amy Sharp, who's the creative writing lead at PPCC right now. And she helped spread the word this year about the speaker today. And her class is listening in right now, so welcome, Amy. And also at the downtown studio, we have our writing center people are helping out there. And Larry Giddings, the head of the writing center, is watching the room right now. And there's a CCR class in there right now watching us, so welcome. And thank you to our sign language people for signing for us today. And let me see, who else? Oh, I almost forgot the most important thing, is leadership. Leadership is paying for this event today. It's specifically Lisa Donaldson is paying, we're paying a small honorarium to our speaker. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Bolton, the college president, for we now have a formal partnership with the Pikes Peak Library District, which is wonderful. We've worked with them from the beginning on all Pikes Peak Reads events, and we have more events that are coming up later on this semester. On December 3rd, we're having another author in, and the Writing Center is doing a contest, so watch for things like that. And most of all, I'd like to thank the Pikes Peak Library District. They're the ones that round up authors and help us bring in people like this to see our students. And you'll get the chance to hear Hampton Sides, who is a wonderful author, and he's going to say something directly to you guys, and then afterwards take a lot of questions and answers. So this is really for you. You're not hearing just a regular canned speech. It's really very special, I think. And Sean Anglem is my buddy at Pikes Peak Library District that puts all this together, and he's going to introduce our author today. Thanks.
Good morning. Thanks for having us, and thanks for being able to partner with Pikes Peak Library District. We're thrilled that we're here today with Hampton Sides. I want to talk to you just very, very briefly about All Pikes Peak Reads. Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you not. About 14 years ago, we decided that we would start a community reads initiative and take a book and encourage the community to read it, and then have some discussion, some events that are based around the book, that sort of thing, and see if we can raise the level of the boats a little bit. We started with one book, and most of them were classics with the authors that were deceased, and we had no opportunity to bring the authors in for talks and that sort of thing. About 5 or 6 years ago, we decided to spread out and add more books in different categories, fiction and nonfiction, and at different age levels of interest, adult, young adult, teen, children's. And now we've moved up to 5 books. So we have 2 adult books this year. We have a wonderful young adult teen book, which is actually a graphic novel, and we have 2 children's books. All of the information about that and the authors that are coming and other events and discussions and things that are happening around All Pikes Peak Reads is in this pullout that the Gazette was so gracious to produce for us. And I have copies at the ends of both of the aisles if you'd like to pick one up. There's some interesting stuff going on. One thing I'd really like to direct your attention to is this thank you down here in the bottom of page 2. And it's a thank you to Colorado College, because the visit of Hampton Sides is made possible by the Colorado College Journalist in Residence program. So we want to thank them for making Hampton Sides available to us. Hampton Sides is a native of Memphis. He has a BA in history from Yale University. He lives in Santa Fe with his wife and his sons. One of his sons actually is a student up here at Colorado College. And he is a well-known and renowned author with many books. I'll give you the titles, but he will go through, I think, some synopses of the books themselves. But Ghost Soldiers, Blood and Thunder, Hellhound on His Trail, and of course, In the Kingdom of Ice, which is our APPR book this year. So we'd like you to enjoy and listen to what Hampton has to say, and then come up with some great questions so he can have some incredible answers. Pressure's on now, Hampton. So without further ado, thank you, and Hampton Sides.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. It's really great to be not only here, but to not be deceased. One of those deceased authors. Not dead yet, anyway. I'm going to talk today a little bit about my trajectory as a writer, how I got into this whole genre of writing, my approach to it, how I do my research, and then finally how I structure and write my books. As he mentioned, I've written 5 histories, and I'll just really quickly tell you about what those books are. The first one is called Ghost Soldiers, and it's about an event that happened in the Philippines in World War II called the Bataan Death March, in which a large number of American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to the Japanese and were sent on a march to prison of war camps where they suffered for 3 years, and many, many died. But late in the war, a group of Army Rangers went behind enemy lines because they found out that the Japanese were going to massacre all of these last prisoners of war, 500 of them. So the U.S. Rangers went behind enemy lines and rescued these guys and brought them to safety. It's an epic World War II story that I kind of fell into. And as I go through these topics, you'll see that I have a little bit of kind of historical ADD. It's all American history, but I jump around to different time periods, different geographical locations. I like to move around, sort of jump in a time machine and go through different kinds of eras. The second book I wrote was called Blood and Thunder, and it's a big book. It's my biggest book. It's about almost 600 pages, and it's a book about the conquest of the American West during the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, as told primarily through the wanderings and adventures of a very controversial, interesting guy that has a connection to Colorado Springs, of course, Kit Carson, Fort Carson being named after him. Kit Carson was a fascinating guy who spoke 5 or 6 Indian languages, knew everyone, did everything, crisscrossed the American West 20 times, and yet is a very enigmatic guy. He was illiterate. No one precisely knew where he was going to end up. He's sort of like Forrest Gump or Zelig. He's one of these characters that just sort of pops up when you least expect him. So I've used him as a through line, kind of a narrative through line to write about the larger story of how this whole western third of the United States, of the North American continent, was conquered and subdued and occupied in one generation, his generation. The next book I wrote was Hellhound on His Trail, which is a book about my hometown of Memphis and about the most pivotal, seismic event that's happened in Memphis's history, which is, of course, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. I got into that story, sort of deconstructing how the whole thing happened, and then became convinced after a lot of research that James Earl Ray was indeed the assassin of Martin Luther King. So I ended up following James Earl Ray during the months leading up to the assassination, and then following him during the manhunt. Most people don't know that it took 65 days for him to be finally captured in London. It's a massive manhunt that involved the FBI and Scotland Yard and Interpol. So it's a big detective story, really, about how he was captured. The most recent book that I did, which is featured here, and it's what I'm here to talk about tonight in Colorado Springs, is a book about the early days of polar fever, when the United States and a lot of other nations were gripped by this obsession, wanting to know what is at the top of the world. It drove people crazy. It was sort of a nagging, gnawing obsession, and it drove people crazy that we couldn't get there, that we didn't know what was up there, and there were all these fairly crazy theories about what was at the top of the world, that there was perhaps a civilization up there, an island, a continent, whirlpools or vents that led down into the interior of the earth. Jules Verne published his book, Journey to the Center of the Earth, about this time, and finally, in the 1870s, a rather epic expedition was mounted that is not very well known by the U.S. Navy and by the United States government to try to reach the North Pole by sailing through the Bering Strait, by trying to find a warm water current that was thought to be there. And this sounds crazy knowing what we know now, but they believed that they could sail to the North Pole, that they would bust through the ice and find a warm water basin that would enable them to get there. And this was the voyage of the USS Jeannette, a not very well-known expedition that I found out about during a trip to Norway 3-4 years ago, and decided to investigate. It took me all around the world. I went to Russia, I went to Siberia, I went to the Bering Strait and Alaska, trying to reconstruct this amazing Gilded Age adventure story. So that gives you a little sense of kind of the ADD that I have, how I jump around from different topics. But how I got into this whole world of writing narrative nonfiction is what I really want to talk about today. First of all, a little bit about nomenclature. It's always bothered me that I work in a profession that has a negative in front of it. Nonfiction. Why are we starting with the assumption that it's made up, and then you have to tell people, no, it's not made up? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Shouldn't it be like truth, truth and non-truth, let's say? It'd be sort of like LeBron James is a non-baseball player. What profession does that? What profession identifies itself by what it's not? But be that as it may, that's the genre that I work in. Narrative nonfiction, sometimes known as literary history or narrative history. And it's interesting because I don't know if we have any history majors here in the room. I was a history major. I was briefly interested perhaps in going down the path of being an academic historian and getting a PhD and so forth. But I remember so many of the papers I had to write for history class. And, history writing as it's taught in most colleges is deadly dull. I'm afraid it'll put you right to sleep. It is not a genre that particularly appreciates narrative and storytelling techniques. And I realized that if I really wanted to tell histories that would be widely read, I needed to take a different path. So after I left college, I became a journalist. And for 25 years, I worked in magazines, newspapers, did some radio journalism, a little bit of television, just learning how to tell stories. Because truthfully, the only real secret to telling interesting and engaging nonfiction is to learn the techniques that any storyteller learns, whether it's a screenwriter, a playwright, someone who writes novels. There is an art and there is a sort of a craft to what we're trying to do. We learn how to build characters, how to paint settings, how to paint scenes, how to describe landscape, how to use techniques of foreshadowing and suspense, how to use dialogue when you can. With nonfiction, it's a little more difficult because you have to have source material. You can't make it up. But so that's what I did for 25 years. I worked for newspapers and magazines, mainly in Washington, D.C., and kind of learned how to get under the hood and take apart the engine of a story. But then finally I got into, when I moved out to Santa Fe and met some veterans from World War II and learned the story of the Bataan Death March and found this story of this rescue that happened in the war, I shifted gears and started writing history. And that's what I've done ever since. This is pretty much a full-time job. When I do, as Sean mentioned, I do teach up at Colorado College. But mainly what I do is work on these books. And I'm now writing a book which is about an early battle in the Korean War, a very important battle called the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, which takes place, unfortunately, in North Korea. I don't really want to go to North Korea right now because, I probably end up doing hard labor for 12 years, smashing, rocks into little pebbles or something like that. But that's my next book, and I'm going around the country interviewing veterans. I plan to go to China to try to interview some Chinese veterans, and also to South Korea. So, what I do is, and by the way, the research for these books, the travel that goes into it is really the fun part. You get to travel all over the world and ask a lot of nosy questions, and I think it really improves the book dramatically when you have a visceral sense of the landscape, of what it really is like to be alive on the ground there. What plants grow there? What is the architecture? What is the atmosphere like? That was certainly true with my Arctic book. I felt, apart from wanting to go to very specific places that figured into the story, I also felt like I needed to understand just what the attraction was of the Arctic to these Gilded Age explorers. The atmosphere, the way sound travels over the ice, the sounds, the weird sounds that ice makes when the ice is constantly moving. It's constantly sort of shaking and shuddering and shrieking and making all these bizarre sounds. And all of that kind of detail came through in the book, I think. And it's important when you're writing, particularly nonfiction, but this is true of fiction as well, that you research it, that you really don't just rely on your memory or what you've read in a book, but to try to get out in the world and drink up the details, the atmospheric details. It gives you a confidence as you go about writing your scenes that really shines through. So, I grew up in the South, in Memphis, and Southerners are reputed to be great storytellers. There's a lot of colorful characters. And in truth, the first writer that I ever met growing up was one of these characters. He was a famous novelist and an even more famous historian, and the star of, any of you seen the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, the massive documentary? He was kind of the star of that. He was a Southern Civil War historian named Shelby Foote. He had this beard and this pipe and this Delta accent, and he looked like a writer, he smelled like a writer, and I probably was about in 8th grade, and I was just really beginning to think about, what is a writer? What does a writer look like? How does a writer talk? What rituals do they go through every day? And this was, for me, the first one I met. And I'm sure that those of you who are, and I understand there are those among you who are interested in writing and maybe doing something with this professionally, you do kind of try on this lifestyle. You kind of want to think, is this me? Is this what I want to do with my life? So I met Shelby, and his son, by the way, and I were in a rock band together. Huggy Foot was his son's name. The names in the Deep South are a little weird. Hampton, Shelby, Huggy. But we basically did everything we could to try to sort of prevent Shelby from finishing his massive trilogy of the Civil War, because we were cranking up the Hendrix and the Pink Floyd and having band practice. And he came up one time in his smoking jacket and rapped on the door and said, Huggy, turn that racket down. I'm working on Appomattox. And we were like, yeah, right, what's Appomattox? We just didn't fully appreciate what he was doing. What he did was he decided to spend 25 years, a quarter of a century, writing a definitive narrative history of the Civil War from beginning to end, and from Fort Sumter to Appomattox, and to tell it like a massive novel with giant characters and huge landscapes, to walk those landscapes himself, to walk the battlefields, to try to understand all the key characters, and to sort of reinterpret the war for a new generation. And so by little, just meeting him and getting to know him and doing a series of interviews with him when I was in high school, and then really sitting down with him when I was in college, I began to get some real interesting ideas about what this thing was called narrative history, what it could be, what it could aspire to be. And I think it's really important because, as I said earlier, academic history does tend to be very dull, and it turns a lot of people off. And I think we all remember going to our history classes in high school and just all the dates and tables and graphs and chronologies, and we forget that there's a story in there, that there are real characters in there, that there's a real tapestry that's interesting. History should be interesting. It certainly was interesting when it happened, but why is it that when we teach history, it seems to be so dull? I think the real reason is because we've forgotten the story part of history. And so that's what Shelby was trying to do, and that's really what I've devoted my career to doing, is trying to make history come alive on the page, to make it interesting to read, to make it lively, and to try to incorporate many of the techniques that we more commonly associate with novels. Everything except for one thing: you don't make anything up. It's all got to be sourced. The notes to my In the Kingdom of Ice book run to about 50 pages. It's very meticulous. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of scholarship. But in the end, you also want readers to read it, because there's just nothing to me that's more unfortunate than someone who spends 3, 4, 5 years of their life writing a book that no one reads, because it's so dull. And so that's certainly something that I like to talk about, is how you make history come alive. How what do you focus on? What are the techniques? And there's certain, when we open it up for questions, that's something that we can certainly talk about. So right now I'm facing a new book, and this is kind of the fun part of a project when you've just signed the contract, you're working with your editor, you're trying to think, who are you going to be the main characters of this book about the Korean War? I'm going around the country interviewing veterans, kind of auditioning them in a way, and they're kind of auditioning me. It kind of works both ways, because they want to make sure that I'm trustworthy. Soldiers don't easily tell their life stories. They went through some very harrowing, very traumatic things, so they're not going to just tell it to anyone. So this is a fun part, and beginning to figure out what were the main places on the battlefield where the interesting action was. Who's alive, who's dead? Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of our Korean War veterans. The Korean War was kind of a forgotten war. I think it's something that we have not really studied as a society, or celebrated as a society. We talk a lot about World War II, but we seem to have forgotten Korean War. And then the other part of it is trying to understand the kind of geopolitics of this war, and why did we go to Korea in the first place? What was what was the sort of the international dimensions of it? This was the early days of the Cold War, and this was one of the very first tests of sort of capitalism versus communism in a kind of a global sense, and the first time that we actually went to battle against the Chinese, which is a scary proposition. Largest country in the world in terms of population. And so I'm doing a lot of reading about the Cold War, and I'm reading about President Truman and Mao and Stalin figures into this story, and MacArthur and McCarthyism is on the rise in the United States. So what I'm trying to say is there's both, when you start out on a book, there's both the kind of minute research that you have to do of like what was happening on the battle, but then you have to do the kind of the big stuff, like what was happening globally, what were the political leaders thinking, what were the stakes, why were we there in the first place? And I hope that when this project is finished, I will have been able to answer most of those questions. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the new book, the In the Kingdom of Ice, which I'm going to do a lecture on tonight. I'm kind of do a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of that book. So In the 1880s, our Navy was ambitious but broke. They didn't have a lot of money. They wanted to begin to compete with the world powers. We were emerging from the devastation of the Civil War. And all the polar exploration that had been happening up to that point, almost all of the good exploration had been done by the British or Scandinavian countries. The United States was just beginning to get into the game of polar exploration. But they didn't have any money, so they reached out to a very wealthy, eccentric guy named James Gordon Bennett Jr., who was the third richest man in New York, publisher and editor-in-chief of the largest newspaper in the world, which was the New York Herald. And this guy decided he would pay for it all. So although it's a U.S. Navy expedition with U.S. Navy officers and a naval ship, it was all paid for by a private citizen. It'd be sort of like Ted Turner of CNN joining forces with NASA to mount an expedition to Mars or something. So in the summer of 1879, a ship was reinforced for the ice in San Francisco. It was practically rebuilt. It was stuffed with all the latest American inventions, including telephones, which had recently been designed by Alexander Graham Bell, lights by Thomas Edison, because the captain wanted to light up the North Pole, and all sorts of telegraph equipment, communications equipment, so they could communicate over the ice. They also stuffed the hold with many casks of Budweiser beer, enough food for 3 years, an organ and many musical instruments so they could have entertainment, and a library with 3,000 volumes. They knew they were heading into the ice and would be gone a long time. So they wanted to be prepared for this. It was almost like we were sending them to the dark side of the moon or another planet. And they left San Francisco in the summer of 1879, went past Alaska, and kept going towards the open polar sea that they hoped they would find. But they didn't find an open polar sea. What they found was ice. They got trapped in the ice, and they began to drift in the ice. For 2 years, they drifted about 1,000 miles, generally in the right direction, heading towards the North Pole, when finally, in the summer of 1881, the enormous pressure of the ice pack crushed the hull of the ship, and the captain, Captain DeLong, and his men were just able to get out on the ice with their dogs and a few belongings and 3 small open boats in time for the ship to sink to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And so these men were suddenly in a very different predicament. They're out on the ice pack trying to figure out how they're going to survive, where are they going to go. The nearest landmass was about 1,000 miles away, the central Arctic coast of Siberia, which is a godforsaken place. It's not really inhabited. It was freezing cold. They had to get over the ice pack, find some open water, and sail the rest of the way to Siberia, and do this all before winter comes on. So really the second half of the book is the story of how the captain held this expedition together, held his men together, and how they struggled over the ice in harness, pulling all their belongings. And it's an amazing survival story, and a story of leadership, a story of comradeship, and how they are successful up to this point. And they do reach open water after 92 days of nonstop struggle. Along the way, they discover 3 islands and explore them. And by the way, they had no food for this 92 days, so they had to hunt constantly. And they are very successful. They hunt polar bear, walrus, seal, and so they're constantly eating that kind of meat. My editor at Doubleday has proposed that we should have a kind of a companion volume to this book, which would be the USS Jeanette cookbook, because they're eating some pretty exotic stuff, entrails of seal and fermented seabirds and really disgusting stuff. But they're not starving, is the point. They're successfully hunting. They're successfully holding this expedition together. They finally reach open water with their boats, only to find that their boats are not seaworthy anymore. because the boats have been bashed and battered over the ice for 92 days. So DeLong and his men have to rebuild the boats using what? Using driftwood and walrus tusks and whale bones and anything they can find on the shores of these little islands that they've discovered. And they do successfully rebuild the boats, get them in the water. They are seaworthy, and they set sail for Siberia. Not a very hopeful place, Siberia, by the way, but that is their only hope. When on the second day they encounter an enormous gale, almost a hurricane, and the three boats are scattered from each other. And unfortunately, the story really becomes a story of the separate fates of those three boats as they make their way toward land. Some do not make it, and I don't really talk specifically about who lives and who dies. Don't Google it. It's more interesting if you don't know, but it's really the story of how these three boats made their way to safety. In the end, of the 33 men, 13 made it home. And they came home as heroes. They were celebrated first of all by the Tsar in St. Petersburg, and then there were parades in New York City, and monuments, and best-selling books, and all sorts of this was a story that was extremely well known in its time. This was an expedition that was studied by subsequent explorers like Peary, who went to the North Pole, and Shackleton, who was the commander of the Endurance that tried to reach the South Pole. They all knew about the Jeanette. They all studied it, but somehow, for some reason, this story fell between the cracks of history. I've been traveling around the country talking about it and asking crowds, "Have you ever heard of the Jeanette?" And barring those who are perhaps reading the book. And almost invariably, no hands shoot up. No one's ever heard of it. It's just one of those stories that kind of fell between the cracks of history, and which is a great opportunity for a historian like me, because it gives me a chance to write about something and hopefully resuscitate an obscure story and bring it back to the place where I think it belongs. Because it is truly one of the great sort of adventure stories, one of the great survival stories. And the Captain DeLong, was a really heroic guy, a great writer. By the way, his journals, his daily logs and journals were republished it became a best-selling book in the 1880s. This is an expedition that is celebrated now. I mean, the only place where you've really heard about it, and people do know about it, is at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, where there's a Jeanette monument, and it's quite well known there. But otherwise, not so great. It's quite obscure. There's one other place where it's well known, and that's in Russia. Even though this was an American expedition, when I went to Russia, everywhere I went, people had heard of the Jeanette expedition. So the book came out about a year ago, and the most interesting sort of aftermath of this, it's been optioned to be a miniseries on HBO, which is nice. We'll see where that goes. But the guy who wrote John Adams on HBO, I don't know if any of you saw that, is on board to write a teleplay, a multi-episode miniseries of In the Kingdom of Ice. So that's interesting. But the other thing, and I think even more interesting for me, is now there are a group of scientists, both in Russia and the United States, who are planning to mount an expedition either next summer or the summer of 2017 to go retrace the voyage of the Jeanette, explore some of those islands which they had originally discovered, and then to find the wreck of the Jeanette. To find it, photograph it, perhaps bring up some relics, bring up some photographs, bring up Edison's lights, and some of the other things in the hold of the ship. So if that happens, I'll be on the ship. I'll be part of this expedition. We're going to bring some descendants of some of the expedition members along. There's going to be a documentary that's going to be made, and so sort of the next phase of this project will happen. And this is something that is true with these books. When you pick a subject like Kit Carson and the West, or the assassination of Martin Luther King, or now this one, you're never really done with it. you get asked to talk about it. There's documentaries. There are expeditions of this sort. It's something that you kind of live with for the rest of your life, and that's great. That's great. I don't want to turn loose of this. So I think that will also be true with my Korean War book. It's something that it's going to be a major investment of time. It's going to take me 2-3 years to do, but even after I'm finished with it, I'll still be working with it for years to come. So it's part of the joy of doing these books is that you kind of, you dig in deep and you drill down deep into these stories, and then they become a part of you for the rest of your life. Okay, let's, if we can, let's kind of open it up for some questions. And I want to say that I was asked to say that this is being streamed to several other locations, and so the mic needs to be on, and you need to, in other words, don't blurt out your question. Let them come to you with a mic here. But I'd like to hear from you about any of these books, about how I write, how I approach the problems of writing, especially interested in talking with you about kind of the craft and the process of writing. So let's open it up for questions if we can.
Just a courtesy reminder to everybody, just try to hold the mic appropriately so you can be heard, okay? And we'll open it up for Q&A.
Anybody want to be first? Okay.
There's
I do
only
have some
20, there's only
questions from the other
20,000.
campus, too.
I think there's 20,000 people watching live. It's no pressure.
Okay, there's
Don't be
like
nervous.
30 people watching, okay?
Oh, 30.
40, okay, well, it could be 50.
Hampton, I have a question. With this expedition coming up and you being on it, do you find that going to be some fodder for a future book of yours about the search itself and that sort of narrative? And yeah,
Okay.
We'll go with that first.
Yeah, well, probably not. I don't think that what I write, what I tend to write is pure narrative history. In other words, I don't put myself or contemporary things in my books. When you open a page of my book, if I've done my job right, you're going back in time, and it's there are no interruptions from me of current times or what I think now or what's happening now. I could see writing a magazine story for something like National Geographic or Outside Magazine where I'm an editor, but I don't think I'd write a whole book on that subject. Depends. I guess if we find it and the findings are really, really, really interesting and something happens particularly noteworthy on the expedition, perhaps there could be a book there, but I don't think so. I like creating a spell with my books, kind of a historical spell, and going way back in time. And when I research these books, I don't really read anything contemporary. I don't read newspapers. I forget that there's I don't know what's happening politically or wars or anything else. I like to read novels that were written back in those times and try to convey the tenor of the times that I'm writing about. So I've never written a book sort of about contemporary events, so I don't think that would happen.
Very good, thank you. Mm-hmm. And quickly, going back in time, did you, through osmosis or observation, get any sort of feeling for work ethic from Shelby Foote?
Yes, Shelby Foote, the historian, the Civil War historian, he had a very particular working style. I don't mimic it or try to mimic it, but first of all, he wrote longhand. He wrote 500 words a day with religious zeal and discipline, and he wrote in this peculiar script that when I would try to read it, it looked like Russian. It was like his own language, and it was impenetrable. I couldn't decipher it. But what I did get from that is that sense of discipline, that a writer, has to be serious about the craft, and you don't wait for the muse to inspire you. It's great when the muse does inspire you, but there's an element of discipline. Every day, get it down on the page. And he also had this thing that I've heard a number of writers do this, is that he would end before, that 500 words, he would end before a piece of action was completed, so that when he began the next day, he would know exactly where he would pick up. he wouldn't have any kind of writer's block or questions about where the next day would begin. So he would kind of end on a cliffhanger, so to speak, and then he would know where to pick up the next day. 500 words a day doesn't really sound like a huge number of words. It's really just about 2 pages. But if you do that every single day for 365 days, and I'm sure he took days off, but you'd be astounded at how quickly the pages begin to pile up, and how much. Yes, he probably had to go back and revise and edit and polish what he'd written, but 500 words a day is a pretty steady clip if you can maintain that over many years. And he worked on this for over 20 years, so it's a giant trilogy. It's 3,000 pages in print. So that's one thing I learned from him, and I think another thing is. Shelby was always reading, and I got that. I picked that up through osmosis and just watching him around. What does he do? He's reading. He's constantly was really into reading Victorian novelists. He was particularly into. He loved Faulkner too, and he loved. He was a very serious reader, and this informed his writing in countless ways. And any of you who really want to be writers. In one way, shape, or form, you need to be serious readers too, and constantly drinking up different styles, different voices, different techniques. The art of writing is deeply embedded in the art of reading. So that's certainly something I got from Shelby. Anybody
Hampton,
else?
I've got a question from the downtown studio. I think everybody would be kind of interested in. Is it ever okay to reconstruct dialogue in narrative nonfiction? We've got a lot of new writers here, and they don't know if it's okay to put the words in people.
Right.
If they were real people.
Yeah. Well, good question, and it is something that I do. Wherever possible, I like to have dialogue, because dialogue is the quickest way to really get into a moment, and it's the quickest way to get into kind of the heads of your characters. But you can't, with nonfiction, you can't just make it up. It's got to come from somewhere. And so the one liberty that narrative historians take, and my colleagues, I've talked with them about this, and they all agree that we do this, which is if someone writes a memoir, and they remember a scene, and they remember the dialogue as having gone a certain way, or if someone writes, let's say if someone, there's testimony at a hearing or a trial where someone remembers under oath the way the dialogue went a certain way, then you can reproduce that dialogue. With the caveat being that in your notes, you say where it came from. This came from this memoir, or this journal, or this trial. And you do it sparingly. You don't, the thing about dialogue is that if you have little snippets of dialogue, it's fine. But if you have page after page after page of dialogue, you know that it's questionable, because we couldn't recreate what I just said 5 minutes ago with any real level of fidelity, right? So that's how I handle dialogue. It either comes from, it was recorded somehow, tape recorded at the moment, it comes from a memoir, or it comes from some kind of testimony that was given. And I do it sparingly and kind of strategically, but I think as long as you do that, it's fine. Otherwise, you're getting into invention. And, there's a whole other genre here that's called historical fiction. There's nothing wrong with historical fiction. By labeling it a novel, you give yourself the freedom to do all kinds of things with dialogue and everything else. You can invent all kinds of things. You can bring in dragons and vampires and werewolves and zombies. It's a novel. But I don't work in historical fiction. I work kind of a few clicks of the dial this way in what we call narrative nonfiction. So I got to be very careful. The other key thing about using dialogue or doing any other kinds of, taking any kinds of liberties is transparency. If you alert the reader clearly in the text and also in the notes, this is what I'm doing, this is where this comes from, it's your own safe ground. Another thing besides dialogue is entering in people's heads. Like, what were people thinking or feeling in a moment, right? It always bothers me in a nonfiction book when someone does that. Like, how do you know what the guy was thinking? You weren't there, but yeah, you might be able to enter in someone's head to a certain extent. If you've read their autobiography and they remember kind of what they were feeling and thinking at the time, or if you know that that guy's son was just murdered, or he just went through a divorce, or he just his parents just passed away. You know, if you happen to know certain facts about that character, you can infer what they were going through at least a little bit. As long as you're transparent with the reader about how you infer that, where that comes from, I think you're on safe ground. Any aspiring writers in the audience, by the way? Anybody who's hoping to do that?
We got a question there too. Got another question.
Sure. Hi there.
Hi. There are several composition students here, and I'm going to ask on their behalf if you can describe your writing process and some of the struggles or problems, things that you find problematic in that process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot of obstacles. You know, writing is hard.
Yes.
Writing is really hard, and even for people who've been doing it for a long time, like me, every day is a struggle. You know, you get up, and some days you just can't write. There is such a thing as writer's block. I've never had a serious case of it, but some days are better than others. The first thing is your writing environment. Like, where do you write? Where do you find that you're comfortable writing? And I have an office, a perfectly good office at home, but I can't work at home, I've found, very well. I can organize my notes, I can read, I can do emails, I can photocopy and scan things, and I do a lot of work at home. But when I'm really seriously writing, I have to leave the house. And I tend to go to coffee shops, 3 or 4 coffee shops in Santa Fe where I live. I sit in a chair, I get a strong cup of coffee, and I'll work all day till the point where there's a dent in the chair. And I literally, there's one coffee shop where I worked for so long, for so many months, and such long hours that one time they actually locked me in the coffee shop with one of those locks that, you know, locks from the inside, and I couldn't get out. I was stuck in that coffee shop all night. So I don't recommend this. You know, I don't think this is the best way to write. It's just a way that I found that I can write. I'm not one of those people who likes to go on a big, long retreat of solitude. You know, I would turn into Jack Nicholson in The Shining in a hurry. I'd become an axe murderer. I need people around. I need noise. I need distraction, but a particular kind of distraction, like noise that I don't have to do anything about, like in a coffee shop. So that's the first thing. You got to find your working environment, the place that makes you comfortable. Everybody's different. Everybody has a different way of tackling that. The next problem, and this is particularly true of nonfiction writing, is you got to organize your material. You know, like you got tons of notes and books and monographs and papers and maps and chronologies that you're working with. And, you know, how do you organize your material? And again, everyone does it differently. Everyone has a different way of tackling that problem. Some people scan everything and have it on their computer. Some people literally lug tons of books with them everywhere they go. One thing, though, that helps me with the way I organize is I tend to work on one little part of the book at a time. If I begin to think about the entire book and all the characters and all the different plot lines, I get dizzy with confusion and distraction, and I can't. But if I focus just on that one little story, whatever it may be, I feel like I'm on solid ground, and I can get through that part of the narrative. But you know, I know people who get really into organization, almost to the point of it becomes procrastination, like color-coded, you know, documents and lots of notebooks with different, like a really elaborate color coding systems and all that kind of stuff. And I don't really do that. I try to be organized, but I think you can go too far in that direction. It becomes like, it's a way of not writing. You know what I mean? You're still playing around with how to organize your index cards or something. And at a certain point, you just got to jump in and start writing. those are the two big things, though: working environment and how to organize your material. Well, one other big thing, though, is deadline. You know, I at least have to have a sense of deadline. Like, this isn't just an open-ended project. I'm going to write it whenever I feel like it. I don't know. I don't feel like it today. I have to give myself, or in many cases, my editor has to give me, a very clear and hard deadline, and use that deadline to my advantage. I think all of us know, I mean, if we didn't have deadlines, probably nothing would get done. And I think a lot of writers think deadlines are the enemy. Like, oh God, if it didn't have that deadline, I could just write the best book ever. But the fact is you probably just wouldn't write the book at all without that deadline. So respect the deadline, embrace it, work with it. I mean, I get terrified still, and I've been doing this a long time now, but when I get close to the deadline, I'm scared. I feel like I have a gun to my head, and that sense of anxiety actually helps me not only write the book, but write it better. I need that. Coming out of a background of newspapers and magazines where the deadline is serious, if you don't make the deadline, the thing is not going to get published. I work with that and use that energy, and I think it's helpful. So that's an important thing. Treat your deadline seriously. Other questions?
Questions here, or I can do one from the Rampart campus. Anybody? Let's do one of these ones that I showed you earlier. Like, did you read 19th century literature when working on this book? Some students noticed similarities not only with Jack London in your lyrical descriptions, but also Jules Verne. We have some
interesting.
lit students here.
Well, yeah, you know, when you're writing a historical subject, I find it's really helpful to read books that were written during that period. Kind of get some of the cadences of the way people wrote and talked and the way they thought. So I read Henry James. I did read some Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth, which involves going essentially to the North Pole. And Journey to the Center of the Earth, they go into a hole in the earth in Iceland, a volcanic opening, and they go down into the interior of the earth, and they find that there is an open polar sea, but it's underground. It's a subterranean sea, and there's dinosaurs and all sorts of creatures down there. It's obviously science fiction, but really an interesting and very influential book. I read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein because you may remember Dr. Frankenstein pursues his monster all the way to the North Pole. I read, what else did I read? Some American authors, Gilded Age authors, Mark Twain. I did not read Jack London, interestingly, but I have read, of course, To Build a Fire and Call of the Wild, and some of those books, I'm sure, are deeply embedded in my psyche because I read them growing up. Jack London, of course, being one of the great writers of Arctic Tales and Tales of Alaska and dog sled teams and kind of He-Man literature of Alaska. But I guess I'm reiterating what I learned from Shelby Foote, which is it is really important to read and to constantly kind of fill up the well with other voices and other styles and approaches when you're working on a project. And the other part of that question, wasn't there a question about my travels?
Yes.
And I did talk about this a little bit, but they wanted to know about, did I go to the Arctic? And, I could have done this book without going to the Arctic. I could have done it without going to Russia, but it wouldn't have been as good a book. It took a lot of time and energy and money to get there, but it was worth it because I think the payoff is both large and small. It's both in terms of things I observed and in the confidence that it gave me to write these passages about the ice pack and about the tundra and the taiga. And, Russia is such a huge place, and I spent about a month in Siberia just running around. Interesting place, kind of scary place, rather corrupt. I had to bargain with a lot of people and barter with a lot of vodka and cigarettes and other things to get to these weird places I had to go. But it paid off, and it was worth it, and it made the book a lot better. So,
I think we're about out of time. Do we have any questions here? Somebody want to tell me, and I'll speak into the microphone for you. If you're
One
feeling
last
shy.
question. Well, thank you guys for listening. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you keep writing and keep learning to also not write, but to appreciate literature and to savor it. And I've enjoyed talking to you today. Take care.
Mr. Sides is going to be at the Library 21C tonight at, is it 7 o'clock? If you'd like to hear him talk, and it's free, and if you'd like to hear him talk about, tonight you're talking more about your Siberia travels, right?
Right.
Yeah, so you can find out some more about that cigarette and vodka part. So, all right. Oh, and we have this is the All Pikes Peak Reads. It'll talk about the different events that are going to be in town, and we're going to have some more events here in December. We're having a graphic novel author visit us, and it'll talk about the stuff that Hampton is doing today. And also, those of you that got those half sheets, there's some more of them when you go out. If you could fill that out for me so I can, we can plan more events like this and make sure that our December event is successful too. Thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate it.